happened. So if you just kind of briefly give that story.
Sure. Well, we had one office in Charleston that encountered Hurricane Hugo. And even though it was on the second floor of an office building, there was 2 feet of water in that went up to 2 feet on the second floor of the storm surge. And part of the continuity plan was to raise everything, all the equipment off the floor and on the desk. And the good part was, while the thing was a mess, most of the equipment actually came through it, so it didn't have to be replaced. Out of that, though, came in the whole plan about getting alternative office space, moving staff, and doing all these different things, including moving staff from other locations to assist, because the people who were living in Charleston, most of them had a tree down in their house or something else going on. It wasn't just that, you know, for me, I just care about the office. You know, you guys can worry about your house. Well, when people have, you know, flooded houses and smashed houses, clearly they need to be able to take care of their family too. And so it took kind of a substantial multiple-week effort to kind of get that up and running. And the work that we did that involved customs work, we're required by law to meet certain filing deadlines, so the government doesn't really much care what your problems are. They just want everything their way. And we had another office in Buffalo, New York that is in an office building. The office building burned up. Whole floor burned up. It was bad lighting. You know, the ballast went bad, sets off a fire on a Saturday, and so because there was nobody there, it really got taken hold of. So we're able to, at the end of the day,
yeah. I was just going to ask you before you leave, because I wanted you to tell a story. I'm sorry, don't go anywhere.
I'm not going anywhere, but you need to...
Oh, you need to stand over here in order to be heard. Sorry.
I'm basically done now.
Then nobody met.
Well, repeat the whole thing all over again.
I'm not gonna do it. But in Buffalo, New York, where this larger office, like there was 40 people stationed there, and at the end of the day, because of the continuity plan, we were starting, the fire hit on Saturday, and by Tuesday we were up and running in an alternative facility, such as it was. Yes, it wasn't great, but it was a start. And even in the continuity plan we had is that we wanted to locate office space as close as we could to where we had the fire, because you want people to have the same routes to work, the same continuity. That clearly things were going to be different and upsetting, but we knew that the more that we could keep things consistent, even where they go to the same takeout for lunch, would be a bit of an advantage. So because these plans were in place, and I would have been inclined to not do them quite so thoroughly, I would have been a little sloppy, because it's sort of my nature, but the company...
Oh, this is confession.
Yes. So, but the company would, the board and the company, you know, made us do these things because they want to protect the shareholders' investment, which I understand, and so you do these things. And of course, when the disaster hit, you take out, oh, here's the plan. What was that? Okay, so you go through it, and actually you find out that when the plan is written fairly correctly and thoroughly, it actually works. That's kind of the neat thing. Yes, there were some rough spots, and not everything went according to the book. But even if 75 or 80% goes by the book, when you think about that, that's 75% you don't have to worry about. So then you focus your effort on the 25% that's still not going well, and so your resources get spent there. So that's a nutshell. Either one of those could have been potentially, the Buffalo one could have been potentially a fatal blow to the business, actually.
And well, so what would that have meant, you know, when you say that? A fatal...
Well, when I left, the gross billings were $600 million of our business, so it was a rather substantial business, and the shareholders would not have been pleased.
So that would have been quite significant, you know. And so Steve's responsibility as the president and CEO is to make sure that, you know, that they had done their business continuity planning, and that they'd assessed the risks, and that they had, you know, developed a plan to deal with that. So we understand that with businesses, that, you know, they're actually, that's part of their, for insurance purposes and whatever, they're mandated to do that for businesses. But somehow we think that the church is exempt from that, but it's not. A church is also a business too. And, you know, if we don't treat it in a business-like way in some of those key areas, then we are really paying a huge price, aren't we?
I read something about, I can't remember the source now, but about 2/3 of the churches that were hit in the New Orleans hurricane never reopened.
Yeah.
And that's sad. I mean, some of them lose their membership list, they lose, people move out, I mean, because they have no plan, but literally 2/3 of the church is closed as a result after the storm in that area. That's probably enough.
So, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate your doing that. And so when we look at the business, though, it's real easy to think, well, of course, we would assume that that's what they would do, right? But what about a church? And so what is basically a ministry risk assessment? It's a process to identify the consequences if there is a disruption to ministry. That means information gathering and recovery strategies. And so, Michael, I'd like you to give just a little bit of a story of what happened with the Crossroads Church in Anthem, and how when they had, you've alluded to this before early on, in our first session, but I'd like you to kind of remind people about that story and how the Crossroads Church, was ready to step forward, and how they stepped forward, in the Ready Anthem. Because they had their own plan in place, they had people identified, and because, they were ready to respond. So,
You're talking about during the flood or
any one of the ones that they responded to are
I think
fine.
I've shared that story before.
We'll just go ahead and do that again. I'm not sure we all heard that, so.
This is a big introduction to you. You're,
Yeah,
this is,
Good bridge.
fall is coming up.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't have images. I like to usually use images, but when there's in North Phoenix, there's a place called Anthem. It's a master plan community, a Del Webb community. There's probably about, just under, 30,000 folks that live there. And yeah, it is, but a lot of residential homes, and there's a Walmart there and so forth. But there was a storm that hits maybe every 30 years it comes, and it almost was like a microburst storm. But in the desert, there's very little drainage. There's the drains that that they kind of dig out in the desert, but there's not a lot of drainage because we don't have a lot of rain. 360 days out of the year it's sunny. So, but when it rains, it pours, and it did quite a bit of flooding. It did quite a bit of damage to some of the commercial facilities and the church that was there too, and it flooded the church. It put about 2 or 3 inches of water into it. And what was interesting is that the business next door didn't have a plan in place, didn't even have flood insurance, and so forth. But what's interesting is in the church you have people already at your disposal, and with the gifts and talents, and because they identified these gifts and talents ahead of time with that thinking, it wasn't as difficult to call upon those folks to intercede and mitigate. It also was a great outreach opportunity because there was 3 homes that were affected that did not have flood insurance as well, and although they had insurance, the desert you typically don't need flood insurance, but they were right into the wash areas where the water just poured into their homes, and it probably put about 4 feet of water into their homes. What's kind of interesting is one gal's home. She said that when she went back into the house, it was a wreck. The thing that was still intact, despite all the things that were wet and soaked, was her Bible. And which is interesting, she remembers putting it on the nightstand. And so here's 4 feet of water, and that nightstand was well under 4 feet, yet her Bible was still dry. So it was through all that, and this fire coming up, they're giving her blankets, all that. She's sharing this story, and this is the story she's sharing on the local news. And so it's just such a great testimony of the church coming together, volunteers coming together, setting up a volunteer check-in, and seeing that kind of story come about, that God can be glorified through it all. So, yeah, you bet.
So, I should probably, just as a disclaimer, Michael didn't even know I was going to call on him to do that. He had no knowledge that I was going to call on him to do that. No preparation whatsoever.
Well, you did good.
And you know who was he in the incident? He was the incident commander. And so his people worked well according to the training that they had. And that's what was so really cool. Oh, Paul, come join us. Oh, absolutely.
I want you to report on
Absolutely.
something there, so-
Yeah, watch out.
Yeah. So it was just so exciting to see that worked. You know what I mean? So all of that preparation, just when it comes together, actually does, what you're hoping it's going to do. And the ultimate thing is that all over the news, the Lord was glorified by his name, specifically. And so even the person, though, that shared was assisted by, I think you assisted her, didn't you, in helping her get her story so that it would be one that, would be picked up. And of course, in Phoenix, it's the 5th largest city in the United States. So what did they do? They asked Mike and some of these other people to come and to be on the news feed. So it really went far beyond the 44,000 people of Anthem, Arizona. And so that's basically in a story what we're hoping to do here, that when we have something here, whether it's a small emergency or a large one, that we will turn it into a magnificent time to glorify Jesus Christ. So I thank you for that, Michael. And then just very, very quickly, and this will be the segment, into what Paul is doing here, and because you've conducted risk assessments before, haven't you, on your job? Yeah. And so, this is something that identifying hazards and threats and things like that. You've done that before and analyzed that. So. One of the things the stories that I always tell is about what happened at the New Life Church in Colorado Springs. And if you know about Colorado Springs, it's like, Christian haven there. So many of our Christian ministries are there, large ministries. And so New Life Church is one of the large churches there. And at the time, it was Dr. Ted Haggart that was at that church. And lo and behold, on a Sunday, they get a call from YWAM, which was over in Denver, and that's the youth mission ministry, and they called and they said, well, we just had an incident here where some of our people were assaulted, and we just wanted you to know that the person is at large. Now, they didn't get a call from the police department, because at that particular time, that hadn't even gotten through the system. The police had just been notified, but YWAM went ahead and they notified the New Life Church and some of the other churches in the area in Colorado Springs. Well, if you know anything about that area between Denver and Colorado Springs, it's probably about 45 minutes drive, between Denver and then where the New Life Church would have been. And so, you could say, well, the security team that they had, this is a mega church, there's 13,000, I think, people that go to that church. It's huge. And so you think, well, so the security team would think, well, that happened over there, it's probably not going to happen over here. But, what was really, really cool about it is Dr. Ted Haggart had actually left. If you remember, that was a tragedy in of itself, where, he actually was removed from his pastorate there at New Life Church. And this was the same first month of this new pastor's, role in the church, if you can imagine. So he gets this call, and they say, well, here's what happened over here and in Denver. And so he goes to his security person, because they had a security team, and he said, here's what happened. Well, immediately the security person says, well, what would you like me to do, Pastor? And the pastor said, I would like you to do whatever it is that you're supposed to do. And so he said, fine, that's what we'll do. Well, he put in both, uniformed and undercover agents. And lo and behold, that person had thousands of rounds of ammunition in their car. They had bombs and all sorts of different weaponry, and came through the door while the church was in session, and an undercover female police officer took them out coming down the hallway. Mm-hmm. Now, if they had not been ready, that would have been probably the follow-on after 9/11 in terms of numbers of people that were lost all in one place, and it was in a church. And so, churches are not exempt. In fact, now we know that churches are even greater targets. And so we see that now with mosques, and we see that with synagogues. We see that with all kinds of things that are happening now that we never used to see before. And so it's becoming quite prolific. And so to do the risk assessment is so key, because then well, these are the things that you kind of try to prepare for, and when you prepare for those, if you do it really well, that even if you have a situation that's somewhat slightly different, you're probably, in principle, prepared for it too, because crises are unknown. If we knew what the crisis was going to be that would come up, that would be a different way of preparing, wouldn't it? But mostly we don't even know. It's the unknown, and that's what strikes us so off guard. So when we're generally prepared and we've done our good risk analysis to be able to know what to be prepared for, then that really helps us to be able to respond better, as we've heard by the business story and the church story and the New Life story on security. So now I'm just going to ask you some questions. Have you done like a risk assessment in terms of identifying the hazards and the degree of potential injury when you did this risk assessment?
Yes.
You did. And did you identify potential loss of life as well as property?
Yes.
And did you identify loss of trust, like, for example, in the children's area, where there would be a loss of trust because we didn't provide security for our children?
Yes.
And did you identify what the vulnerabilities and weaknesses are? Say, for example, if we had a data breach or something, did you assess that? What the effect would be?